Then it really hit me. I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill,
On April 23rd, 1972, Apollo 16 astronaut Charles Duke placed a family photograph on the surface of the moon, pressed it into the gray dust with his gloved hand, and walked away. He was 36 years old. He had just become the youngest human being ever to walk on another world. He never went back. Nobody did. And 50 years later, sitting in a church in New Braunfels, Texas, Charles Duke, the man who bounced across the Descartes Highlands at 1/6 gravity and held a lunar rock older than anything alive on Earth, told an interviewer that what he experienced on the moon changed something inside him that no amount of debriefing could reach. This video goes inside that story. What Duke saw, what he said, what the official record omits, and why the most decorated lunar program in human history ended with 12 men, 1 family photograph, and a silence that has lasted more than 5 decades. Charles Moss. Duke Jr. was born on October 3, 1935 in Charlotte, North Carolina. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1957, earned a master's degree in aeronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1964, and logged more than 4,000 hours of flight time before NASA ever put him in a spacecraft. He was not a passenger. He was one of the most technically prepared human beings alive. NASA selected him as an astronaut in April 1966 as part of Group 5, the same class that included Fred Hayes and Edgar Mitchell, and he spent the next several years training for the most demanding operational environment in the history of human exploration. His first major role was not on the moon. It was in a small back room at Mission Control in Houston on July 20, 1969, when Duke served as Capcom, the capsule communicator, the single voice that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin heard from Earth during the Apollo 11 landing. When the Eagle's computer threw a series of 1202 program alarms with the lunar surface rushing up through the window, it was Duke's voice, calm and precise, that came through, "Roger, alarm, we are go on that." He was 33 years old, and he was shepherding the first human lunar landing from a console in Texas while the world held its breath. 3 years later, he walked on the moon himself. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972, and touched down in the Descartes Highlands on April 20th. Duke and mission commander John Young spent 71 hours on the surface. They drove the lunar rover 27 kilometers across terrain no human being had ever touched. They collected 95.8 kilograms of lunar samples. By every official measure, the mission was a complete success. That is the official version. What Duke said in the decades that followed does not contradict the mission record, but it extends well beyond it in ways that the debriefing transcripts do not capture. Duke has spoken publicly and at length about the experience of standing on the moon. Not just the technical execution, but something harder to categorize. In a 2011 documentary interview, he described the emotional and psychological weight of the experience as something that accumulated during the mission and did not resolve when the capsule splashed down. He returned to Earth, he later said, as a man who had physically stood in a place that most human beings would never see, even in photographs taken from orbit, and he felt, in his own words, profoundly empty. The mission was complete, the samples were catalogued, the press conferences were done, and Duke found himself standing in the middle of a successful life with no framework for what he had just experienced. This is not the story NASA told. The agency's official narrative of the Apollo program is one of engineering triumph and national will. 12 men walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. They planted flags, drove rovers, hit a golf ball, and came home. The program ended not because of failure, but because of budget. Congress cut funding. The public lost interest. Apollo 17 in December 1972 was the last mission, and that was that. That explanation has always had a structural problem. NASA had already built the hardware for Apollo 18, 19, and 20. The Saturn V rockets were manufactured, the mission profiles were designed, the astronauts were trained. Canceling 3 fully prepared lunar missions on budget grounds while the hardware sat complete in a warehouse in Huntsville, Alabama, has never fully satisfied the people who built the program. And several of the men who flew those missions have said in scattered interviews across 5 decades that the official explanation is incomplete. Duke was among them, not loudly, not in the conspiratorial register that his name sometimes gets attached to online, but in a series of interviews, appearances, and written reflections spanning from the mid-1970s through the 2010s, he described the moon not as a conquered destination, but as a place that left marks on the people who went there that the mission reports never documented. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14 in February 1971, founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973, 1 year after returning from space, specifically to study the intersection of consciousness and scientific inquiry. Mitchell said publicly and on record that during his return from the moon he experienced what he described as an instant of profound clarity, a sense of universal connectedness that he could not explain within the scientific vocabulary he had spent 20 years acquiring. He spent the rest of his life, until his death in 2016, trying to build a framework for that experience. Alan Bean, who walked on the moon during Apollo 12 in November 1969, left NASA and became a painter. He devoted the remaining 40 years of his life, until his death in 2018, exclusively to painting scenes from the lunar surface. He mixed lunar dust, actual regolith from the samples he had brought back, into his paint. He said in a 2013 interview that he painted because the moon changed what he understood to be real, and painting was the only medium that came close to capturing it. He never painted anything else. James Irwin, who walked on the moon during Apollo 15 in July 1971, became an ordained minister within 2 years of returning. He founded a Christian organization called High Flight Foundation and spent the rest of his life, he died in 1991, describing the lunar experience as a direct encounter with the presence of God, not metaphorically. Irwin said the moon was where he first clearly heard what he believed to be a divine voice, and that the mission had been less a scientific expedition than a spiritual one that NASA had not anticipated and could not debrief. Duke's transformation followed a similar arc, but on a longer timeline. He returned from Apollo 16 in April 1972 and spent the next several years by conventional measures thriving. He retired from the Air Force as a Brigadier General, ran a beer distributorship in Texas, lived in a large house with his wife Dorothy and their 2 sons. And by his own account, he was thoroughly miserable. He described a period of anger, emotional distance, and a search for something he could not name. In a 1994 interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, Duke said, "I was very successful on the outside and very empty on the inside." In 1978, Dorothy became a Christian. Duke, skeptical and by his own description, prideful, resisted. Then in 1980, at a Bible study meeting in their home, a meeting he attended primarily to keep peace with his wife, he had what he described as a conversion experience. He has described this moment in multiple interviews as the most significant event of his life, more significant than walking on the moon. He became a Christian minister, he began speaking publicly about his faith, and he began connecting, in his public statements, the experience of standing on the lunar surface with the spiritual transformation that followed 8 years later. This connection is not something Duke made casually or once. He has returned to it consistently over 4 decades. In a 2013 interview at a church conference in Germany, he said that standing on the moon made him feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely small. Not in a distressing way, but in a way that broke something open. He described looking back at Earth from the Descartes Highlands, a blue-white circle roughly the size of his thumbnail held at arm's length, and feeling a certainty that what he was seeing could not be the product of accident. He did not say this as a scientific claim. He said it as a testimony. What makes Duke's account worth examining carefully is that he is not a man given to exaggeration or loose language. His career was built on precision. Capcom operators at NASA were selected for their ability to stay calm and speak accurately under conditions that would unmoor most people. Duke spent years in that role. His public statements about his lunar experience are measured, consistent, and specific. He does not claim to have seen anything anomalous on the surface. He does not claim a hidden briefing or a suppressed encounter. What he claims is something subtler and in some ways harder to categorize. That the moon did something to him that the mission profile did not account for and that NASA had no procedure to address. He is not alone in that assessment. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, at least 6 underwent significant life changes within 5 years of their return that took them in directions, religious conversion, consciousness research, art, ministry, that their pre-mission profiles did not predict. This is a small sample size by any scientific standard, but it is also the complete population. Every human being who has walked on the moon fits in that group, and half of them came back and moved in directions that the agency that sent them there has never formally addressed. NASA's official position, to the extent it has one, is that astronauts are human beings and their post-mission lives are their own. The agency has not commissioned research into the psychological long-term effects of lunar surface operations. The closest formal study was a 1972 report on post-mission adjustment that focused on reintegration into civilian or military life and said nothing about the categories of experience that Mitchell, Duke, Bean, and Irwin were already beginning to describe publicly. The report ran 47 pages. It contained no mention of spiritual experience, altered perception, or the kind of profound disorientation that several crew members were reporting in interviews while the report was being written. If you have never heard any of this before, the painter, the minister, the consciousness researcher, the Capcom who said the moon cracked him open, hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of buried history this channel goes deep on every single week. The question of why humans have not returned to the moon since December 1972 has a standard answer and a more complicated one. The standard answer involves money, political will, and the shift of NASA's institutional focus toward the Space Shuttle program, approved by President Nixon in January 1972, 8 months before Apollo 17 launched. Under that framing, the Moon program ended because the government decided to invest in reusable low Earth orbit infrastructure rather than expensive single-use missions to a destination that had already been visited 6 times. That explanation is accurate as far as it goes, but it has a gap in it that several people inside the program have pointed to over the years. The gap is this. In December 1972, humanity possessed functional hardware, trained crews, and a 50-year head start on returning to the Moon. Every subsequent attempt to return, the various Constellation program initiatives, the Artemis program announced in 2019, the series of launch delays and technical setbacks that have pushed crewed lunar return from 2024 to at least 2026 and possibly later, has required rebuilding from a near standing start at enormous cost, as if the institutional knowledge of Apollo simply evaporated. Some of it did. Engineers who worked on the Saturn V rocket retired or died. Manufacturing processes were not documented in ways that allowed direct reconstruction. The F-1 engine, the most powerful single-chamber rocket engine ever flown, required what NASA engineers in 2013 described as reverse engineering to understand, meaning they were studying their own hardware to figure out how it had been built, because the original documentation was insufficient to reconstruct it. This is not a classified revelation. NASA published a report on the F-1 engine reverse engineering project. The finding was that critical manufacturing knowledge had been lost. Duke has never claimed that this institutional knowledge loss was deliberate. He has not attributed the half-century gap to conspiracy or suppression. What he has said, in multiple venues, is that the program ended before anyone fully understood what it had produced, not just in terms of lunar samples and engineering data, but in terms of what it did to the human beings at its center. He has said, in an interview at Liberty University in 2018, that he believes the Moon missions were part of something larger than a space race, and that the men who went there were changed in ways that the program designers had not anticipated, and that the program's abrupt end prevented anyone from studying. That framing raises a question that nobody has formally answered. If the Apollo program had continued, if Apollo 18, 19, and 20 had flown as planned, if additional crews had spent longer durations on the surface, if the psychological and spiritual effects that Duke and Mitchell and Irwin and Bean described had accumulated across a larger population, what would the data have shown? We do not know. The program ended before the question could be asked in any systematic way. The 3 cancelled Apollo missions, 18, 19, and 20, were officially cancelled in September 1970 by NASA Administrator Thomas Paine, citing budget constraints imposed by the Nixon administration. The Saturn V rockets that had been manufactured for those missions were subsequently placed on permanent outdoor display. One sits at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, one sits at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, one is at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. They are the largest rockets ever built. They are parked outside in the weather. The decision to cancel the missions rather than delay them, and to display rather than preserve the hardware, has been described by at least 3 former NASA engineers in published interviews as one of the most consequential and least examined decisions in the history of the agency. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who flew on Apollo 17 and remains the last living human being to have walked on the Moon, has been publicly critical of the decision to end the program for decades. In a 2019 interview with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Schmitt described the cancellation as a monumental mistake and said that the scientific return from continued missions would have been transformative. He was specifically describing geology and sample return. But in a separate 2016 interview with Space News, he went further, saying that what the Apollo program had proven, not just scientifically but in terms of human capacity, had never been fully absorbed, and that the rush to end it had cost something that could not be measured in budget terms. Duke puts it differently. He does not talk about scientific loss. He talks about spiritual acceleration, a phrase he has used in several Christian-speaking contexts to describe the effect of the lunar experience on the men who had it. His argument, stated plainly, is that going to the Moon exposed human beings to something that accelerated the questions they were already carrying, questions about meaning, purpose, origin, and scale. And that without the program to contextualize those questions within a shared institutional framework, each astronaut worked through them alone, in the direction their own temperament carried them. Mitchell went toward science and consciousness research. Bean went toward art, Irwin went toward evangelical Christianity, Duke went toward ministry on a slower path, Buzz Aldrin, who has been publicly candid about the severe depression and alcoholism he experienced after Apollo 11, described in his 1973 memoir Return to Earth a sense of purposelessness so acute that it took years to resolve. Neil Armstrong, the most famous human being to have walked on the Moon, withdrew almost completely from public life after Apollo 11 and spent the following decades in rural Ohio, teaching aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati, refusing nearly all interview requests, and speaking almost never about what the surface of the moon had felt like to stand on. He died in 2012 without leaving a detailed account. The absence of Armstrong's testimony is significant. He was the first. If any single human experience on the lunar surface should have been documented in depth, it was his. It was not. Armstrong gave a small number of carefully controlled interviews over 4 decades and said almost nothing that was not already in the public mission record. Whether that silence was personal preference, institutional pressure, or the product of an experience he found genuinely difficult to describe is something that no one who knew him well has ever fully explained on the record. Duke has been asked about Armstrong's reticence. In a 2014 interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, he said that Neil was a private man and that he believed Neil processed the experience internally in the way that engineers process things. He did not speculate beyond that, but he added something that is worth sitting with. He said that every person who went to the moon came back with more questions than they had taken with them, and that the questions were not engineering questions. That statement, from the youngest person ever to walk on the moon, from the man who was the voice in Armstrong's ear during the first landing, deserves more weight than it typically receives in the standard history of Apollo. The Artemis program, NASA's current effort to return humans to the moon, has been described by the agency as a continuation of the Apollo legacy. The first crewed lunar landing attempt, Artemis III, has been projected for no earlier than 2026. The crew has not been finalized. The hardware, specifically the SpaceX Starship lunar lander, has not completed all required qualification tests. The program has already slipped its original 2024 target by at least 2 years. Charles Duke, now 88 years old, has said in recent years that he hopes humans return to the moon in his lifetime. He has said it with the specificity of a man who has been there, who knows the grey colour of the regolith, the absolute blackness of the sky above it, the way the Earth sits motionless on the horizon, while the ground beneath your boots is as old as the solar system. He does not talk about Artemis in political terms. He talks about what the moon does to people who go there, and what the world might learn if more people went. That family photograph he pressed into the dust on April 23, 1972, a photograph of himself, Dorothy, and their 2 sons, Charles and Tom, is still there. It has been sitting on the surface of the Descartes Highlands for more than 50 years, undisturbed, exposed to the full radiation of space, slowly fading. It is the only family portrait on the moon. Duke left it there deliberately. He has said that he left it as a marker, not of accomplishment, but of the moment when he understood, standing in the silence of a world with no atmosphere, no wind, no sound, except his own breathing inside the helmet, that what he had been taught to believe about the scale of human life was not wrong, but was radically incomplete. The question this channel wants to leave with you is one that Charles Duke himself has never directly answered in 50 years of public speaking. If the moon changed the men who went there in ways that neither NASA nor the astronauts themselves could fully explain, what does that mean for the 50 years of silence that followed? Leave your answer in the comments. This community runs deep on questions like this one, and the best responses always come from the people watching on a screen bigger than a phone. If this is the first time you have found this channel, subscribe now. Every week goes somewhere the standard history does not.